There are stories in war that are about strategy. There are stories about glory. And then there are stories that defy the laws of biology and physics. Stories that belong in the realm of nightmares, not history books. August 6, 1915. The Eastern Front. Imagine standing in a trench. It's early morning. The sun is just starting to bleed over the horizon. The air is still, too still. Suddenly, the birds stop singing. You look out over no man's land, and you see it. A wall. Not of soldiers, not of tanks. A wall of green fog. It's moving towards you, hugging the ground like a predator. It's quiet, it's heavy, and it kills everything it touches. Within minutes, your lungs are melting. You are drowning on dry land. You are dead. Technically, you are dead. But on this specific morning, in a forgotten fortress in the swamps of Poland, the dead did not stay down. They stood up. They fixed their bayonets, and they charged. This is the story of the Osowiec Fortress, the story of the day the German Empire, with all its science and might, looked into the face of death and ran away in terror. Opening title sequence: The Attack of the Dead Men. Chapter 1: The Iron Lock. Visuals: Map of Europe, 1914. Zoom in on the border of Russian Empire and East Prussia. Arrows showing German troop movements. Narrator: To understand the horror of 1915, we first have to understand the geography of 1914. World War I was a war of movement that quickly turned into a war of stagnation. On the Western Front, men were dying for inches of mud in France. But on the Eastern Front, the scale was massive. We are talking about thousands of kilometers of forests, swamps, and plains. The German army, the most efficient fighting force on the planet, had a problem. They needed to move east. They needed to strike at the heart of the Russian Empire. But there was a geographical nightmare standing in their way: the Masurian lakes and the Bibza marshes. These weren't just puddles. These were impassable, deadly swamps that stretched for miles. Tanks would sink, horses would drown, artillery couldn't move. There was only one way through, one railway line, one road. A narrow strip of dry land that acted as a bridge across the swamp. And sitting right in the middle of that strip, blocking the door like a bouncer at a club, was Osowiec. Osowiec wasn't just a bunker. It was a beast. Built in the late 19th century by the Russian Empire, it was designed specifically to stop a German invasion. It consisted of 4 massive forts connected by trenches and tunnels. The walls were made of reinforced concrete and brick, meters thick. It was armed to the teeth with heavy artillery, machine gun nests, and searchlights. For the Russian High Command, Osowiec was the lock of the north. As long as the fortress stood, the Germans couldn't use the railway. If they couldn't use the railway, they couldn't supply their army. If they couldn't supply their army, they couldn't take Russia. It was that simple. The Germans knew this. General Paul von Hindenburg, the mastermind of the Eastern Front, looked at his maps and circled Osowiec with a red pencil. He didn't want a siege. He wanted a blitzkrieg. He ordered his commanders, take it, quickly. But Hindenburg was about to learn a painful lesson. Osowiec was not going to fall quickly. In fact, it was going to become the graveyard of German ambition. The first attempt to take the fortress happened in September 1914. The Germans tried a direct assault. They threw infantry at the walls. They were mown down by Russian machine guns. They realized, okay, we can't take this with rifles. We need to smash it. So, in February 1915, they returned, and this time, they brought the monsters. They brought the heavy siege artillery, the pride of the Krupp industrial empire, the Big Berthas. These were 420mm howitzers. Let's put that into perspective. A standard field gun fires a shell that you can hold in your hands. A Big Bertha fires a shell that weighs nearly a ton. It's the size of a small car. When it hits, it doesn't just explode, it creates an earthquake. The Germans set up these guns beyond the range of the Russian artillery. They felt safe, they felt superior, and then the rain of fire began. For weeks, the sky over Osowiec turned black. The Germans fired over 250,000 heavy shells at the fortress. 250,000. The earth shook so violently that in villages 10 miles away, window panes shattered and church bells rang by themselves. Inside the fortress, it was hell. The concrete cracked. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged day and night. The smoke was so thick that the sun was blocked out for days. The Russian defenders, commanded by Major General Nikolai Bruchowski, were living like rats. They hid deep in the underground bunkers. The noise was maddening. Men went deaf. Men went insane from the constant concussion of the blasts. But they didn't surrender. In fact, they did something incredible. The Russian artillerymen waited. They calculated. They watched the flashes of the German guns on the horizon, and even though they had smaller guns, they were accurate. In a duel that stunned the German commanders, the Russian batteries managed to land direct hits on 2 of the Big Berthas. They knocked out the German siege giants.
Hindenburg was furious. The fortress was a ruin, yes. It was a pile of smoking rubble. But the machine guns were still active. The railway was still blocked. The Russians were still there, digging in deeper among the bricks, refusing to die. By the summer of 1915, the situation was desperate for Germany. The war was dragging on. They needed a breakthrough. They couldn't afford to spend another 6 months throwing expensive shells at stubborn Russians. They needed a way to kill the defenders without destroying the railway lines. They needed a weapon that could creep into the bunkers, go around corners, and sink into the deepest tunnels. They needed chemistry. Enter Fritz Haber, a brilliant German chemist, a Nobel Prize winner, a patriot, and the man who would arguably become the father of modern chemical warfare. Haber proposed a simple, terrifying idea to the German High Command. If we cannot blast them out, he reasoned, we must smoke them out, like rats. The weapon of choice was chlorine. Chlorine is a common element. You use it to clean your swimming pool. You use it to bleach your clothes. But in high concentrations, it is a nightmare agent. It is an irritant. It attacks the mucous membranes, eyes, nose, throat, lungs. When chlorine gas interacts with water, the water in your eyes or the moisture in your lungs, it undergoes a chemical reaction. It turns into hydrochloric acid. Imagine that. Acid forming inside your chest, dissolving your lung tissue from the inside out. Using poison gas was technically illegal. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had forbidden the use of poison or poisoned weapons. But in 1915, desperate times called for desperate crimes. The Germans argued that they weren't using poison bullets. They were just releasing gas from cylinders, a legal loophole that would cost thousands of lives. They had already tested it at Ypres on the Western Front in April. The results were horrific. Allied soldiers choked to death in their trenches. Now they decided to bring this nightmare to the east, to Osowiec. Visuals. German soldiers digging at night, carrying heavy cylinders. Officers looking at maps. Narrator. In July 1915, a special German unit arrived at the front lines near Osowiec. This wasn't infantry. These were gas pioneers. They worked at night to avoid detection by Russian spotters. They dug into the front-line trenches. They buried 30 batteries of gas cylinders, thousands of steel tanks filled with pressurized liquid chlorine. They camouflaged the cylinders with brush, wood, and dirt. And then they waited. Gas warfare is not like artillery. You can't just push a button. You are at the mercy of nature. You need the wind. If the wind is blowing toward you, you kill your own men. If the wind is too strong, the gas disperses too quickly. If the wind is too weak, the gas sits there and doesn't move. You need a gentle breeze, blowing directly toward the enemy. For 10 days, the German meteorologists watched the sky. The soldiers sat in the trenches, nervous. They knew what was in those tanks. They had heard the rumors. They had their gas masks ready. On the other side, the Russians had no idea. Osowiec was exhausted. The men were starving. Their uniforms were rags. They were running low on ammunition. And worst of all, they had zero protection against chemical weapons. In 1915, the Russian army had not yet issued gas masks to its troops. The only advice they had received was vague. If you see colored smoke, cover your face. Some officers had instructed soldiers to pee on rags and tie them around their mouths. The ammonia in urine reacts with chlorine and neutralizes it slightly. Think about the desperation of that situation. Your only defense against the high-tech weapon of mass destruction is a dirty rag soaked in your own urine. August 5th. The wind shifts. August 6th, 3:30 a.m. The German commander looks at the weather vane. It's pointing east, toward the fortress. The speed is perfect. He nods. The order is passed down the line. Open the valves.
4 a.m., August 6th, 1915. The valves are opened. At first, it sounded like steam escaping from a locomotive, a sharp hiss that cut through the morning silence. Then the sound became a roar. From the German lines, a dark, opaque cloud began to rise. It wasn't gray like smoke. It was green, a sickly yellowish-green color, like bruised skin. The cloud didn't rise into the sky. It was heavy. Chlorine is 2.5 times heavier than air. It sank. It filled the shell craters. It flowed into the ditches. It poured into the trenches like water. Driven by the gentle wind, this wall of death, estimated to be 12 kilometers wide and 12 meters high, began to roll toward the Russian positions. The devastation was immediate and total. This wasn't just a weapon against soldiers, it was a weapon against nature itself. As the gas moved across the fields, witnesses described a scene from a biblical apocalypse. The grass turned black and died instantly. The leaves on the trees curled up, turned yellow, and fell off in a matter of minutes. Flowers withered. In the fields, insects died mid-air. Frogs, mice, moles, anything living in the grass suffocated. Even the metal equipment of the soldiers began to change. The brass buttons on uniforms turned green. The copper parts of the guns oxidized. The cloud traveled slowly. It took about 5 to 10 minutes to reach the Russian forward trenches. 5 minutes. Imagine being a Russian sentry. You see this green fog coming. You can't shoot it. You can't hide from it. You know that when it reaches you, you will die. And you have 5 minutes to wait for it. When the gas hit the Russian trenches, panic erupted. The 226th Zemlyansky Regiment was stationed in the forward positions. The 9th, 10th, and 11th companies took the full force of the blow. Men woke up choking. The gas crept into the dugouts where they were sleeping. There were no gas masks. I repeat, there were no gas masks. The chemical reaction was merciless. Chlorine, upon contact with the moisture in the lungs, turns into hydrochloric acid. It burns, it corrodes, it dissolves. Soldiers ran blindly through the trenches, clawing at their throats, trying to tear out the fire burning inside their chests. They foamed at the mouth. Blood streamed from their noses and ears. Their eyes turned red and then went blind as the corneas were burned away. "Water! Water!" men screamed. But pouring water on their faces only made it worse. Water just created more acid. Officers, choking on their own blood, tried to maintain order. They shouted the only instruction they knew: "Wet your rags, pee on them, cover your faces." It was a scene of absolute horror. Hundreds of men crouched in the mud, holding urine-soaked cloths to their faces, listening to the gurgling sounds of their comrades drowning on dry land. Within 20 minutes, the 9th, 10th, and 11th companies effectively ceased to exist. Out of hundreds of men, only a handful were left twitching on the ground. The rest were piles of corpses. Their skin had turned a dark greenish black. Their faces were frozen in masks of agony. The gas didn't stop at the trenches. It penetrated deep into the fortress. It seeped into the artillery positions. It killed the wounded in the hospital wards. By 4:30 a.m., the fortress of Osowiec was a graveyard. The silence returned. A heavy, chemical silence. On the German side, the commanders lowered their binoculars. The cloud had done its work. The Russian lines were silent. No return fire, no movement. Field Marshal von Hindenburg's plan had worked perfectly. The order was given: advance. 14 battalions, 7,000 men. This wasn't a tactical assault, this was a march of victory. The German soldiers put on their gas masks, primitive, rubberized masks that made them look like aliens or monsters, and climbed out of their trenches. They were confident. They were told there would be no resistance. They were told that everyone in the fortress was dead. They walked across no man's land. They walked through the blackened grass and the dead birds. They reached the first line of Russian trenches. They looked down. The trenches were filled with bodies. The gas had done its job. The Russians were piled on top of each other, twisted in unnatural poses. The Germans moved on. They felt a mix of relief and disgust. It was a massacre, but at least the fight was over. They cut through the barbed wire. They secured the first defensive line. They moved toward the second line. They were close to the heart of the fortress. The railway bridge was in sight. The victory was minutes away. The German Landwehr soldiers relaxed their grip on their rifles. Some probably lifted their masks slightly to get better visibility, thinking the gas had dispersed enough. They were walking into a trap. Not a trap set by the living, but a trap set by the dying.